This is an excerpt of a conversation between J. Craig Venter and Emil Jacobs, brought to you by the Chemical Heritage Foundation's annual T.T. Chow Symposium.
Well, since you raised the subject of CO2 in the atmosphere, let me ask you about that. It's clear that this technology is a renewable technology, but is it a green technology? What's produced is going to be what's burned and produces carbon that goes in the atmosphere. But of course, the reactor, the algae themselves, also sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And I know a lot of the publicity that you've done around this talks about that balance. But what's the actual balance? Is it balanced, or is there still burning the fuel put out more carbon dioxide than growing the algae brings back?
We clearly recognize that we need to address that question. So SGI, ExxonMobil, and MIT kicked off a collaboration about a year ago now to look at life cycle assessment for algae biofuels. And it was done with kind of third-party data. So there's no proprietary data that went into the analysis. And the reason we did it with third-party or kind of readily available data was to where we could do the work and then publish the results and have other people comment on our life cycle assessment. Was it done correctly? Did you make an assumption here that someone else would have done something there? So we've done the work for CO2 and for fresh water, and basically done the life cycle assessment for algae-based biofuels, looking at it from a CO2 and fresh water perspective. And if you make some reasonable assumptions on what a commercial facility would look like, from a CO2 perspective, you're about equal to petroleum-based products today. If you say I can do something that may or may not be able to fit into a commercial flow scheme, you can get down to the renewable fuel standard. So from a CO2 perspective, the life cycle assessment is very, very attractive. From a fresh water perspective, it's a slam dunk. So if you compare it to any other biofuel where you have to use any irrigation at all, if it's rain-fed corn, rain-fed soy, it wins. But if there's any irrigation, it blows away the other option. So from a fresh water perspective, the life cycle assessment is also very attractive. And it's really because the systems that we're looking at are either saltwater based or brackish water based. It's probably going to be a saltwater system with brackish water makeup. And from that perspective, it's significantly better than the other biofuel options. So again, in anticipation of someone asking that question, we're out doing that work now. That work will be published probably before the end of the year, maybe early next year. We'll get comments back on that. We may have to do a recycle on that. Then we'll look at other other life cycle assessments on this system, and again, to get the discussion. And hopefully we get the world, kind of saying, that's a pretty good way to do it. Now let's apply that same mechanism to other biofuel options and see how they can compare. And that way you can look across all of the options in a consistent manner.
In fact, there's a little bit of misnomer in the way you asked it. We can't use atmospheric CO2. It's fortunately too low of a concentration. We need concentrated CO2. So when people talk about carbon sequestration, I argue that they have it mostly wrong, because sequestering it, burying it in the ground is the wrong thing to do. We think CO2, or I think CO2, will be the ultimate raw material for the future, whether it's for our kinds of system where we have to have concentrated CO2 going in, whether it's producing chemicals, food, et cetera. Recycling the CO2 will be the key way to go.